"Ma'am, are you listing a property that you don't own?" the police officer asked as Karen from the HOA stood in the middle of my 150-year-old ranch, waving around fake contracts and screaming about community oversight rights. I thought she was just power tripping like usual until I saw my ranch listed for sale on a real estate website, complete with descriptions that made it sound like she was the act. I didn't call the police. I made one phone call, and a few days later Karen discovered that her own house was no longer hers. Karen had no idea that while she was busy giving tours of my seized property to potential buyers somewhere else, the transaction had been completed. And by the time she returned home, swiped her card and couldn't get in, saw the new locks and the no trespassing sign hanging in front of her gate, Karen finally understood she had just picked the wrong opponent. You're watching Harper Stories. So, where is this story coming from? I'm Marcus Thompson, and this story starts with a spam email I almost deleted, but thank God I opened it. That's when I discovered that the ranch I inherited from my grandfather was being listed for sale by someone I'd never even met. Let me back up a bit here. 6 months ago, I was just an urburned-out software engineer in downtown Austin, debugging code for a tech startup that promised to revolutionize human connection while I sat alone in my cubicle eating microwaved ramen for a tethered day straight. Then, Grandpa Joe passed away, leaving me Moonrise Ranch, a 150-year-old property on the outskirts of Austin that had been in our family since the 1870s. The place used to be a horse station back in the day, one of those old frontier stops where travelers would rest and change horses before continuing their journey west. I'll be honest, inheriting the ranch felt like inheriting someone else's dream. I knew nothing about country living, had never owned anything bigger than a houseplant, and the closest I'd come to manual labor was assembling IKEA furniture. But something about walking through those weathered wooden buildings, seeing the ancient oak trees that had watched over generations of my family, made me feel connected to something bigger than myself. Grandpa Joe used to say, "Son, sometimes people you by trying to take away what you love most. That's when you prove who you are." I thought it was just old man wisdom until Beverly Whitmore entered my life. Beverly was the kind of person who introduced herself with her Beverly Whitmore, president of the Sunset Hills Homeowners Association, licensed real estate professional and community standards coordinator. She showed up at my door 3 days after I moved in, clipboard in hand, wearing a powers suit that screamed, "I speak Tomanagers professionally." Her first words to me were, "Mr. Thompson, I assume you're aware that your property, while technically outside our HOA boundaries, still falls under all community oversight provisions due to its proximity and visual impact on neighborhood property values." I had no idea what half of those words meant strung together like that, but I nodded politely and offered her some coffee. That was my first mistake. Beverly interpreted politeness as weakness and coffee as an invitation to conduct a full property inspection. She walked around my ranch like a health inspector in a greasy diner, taking notes on everything from the non-conforming fence design to the inappropriate agriculturalistic in a residential zone. She informed me that I'd need to submit a landscaping plan for approval, paint our buildings in community-approved neutral tones, and remove the old windmill because it created visual pollution. When I gently explained that my property wasn't part of her HOA, she laughed like I just told her the earth was flat. "Mr. Thompson," she said, adjusting her designer glasses with a kind of smile that never reaches the eyes, "property law is more complex than most people understand. Easements, covenant restrictions, and community impact assessments create a web of legal obligations that extend far beyond simple ownership boundaries. I've been doing this for 20 years, and I can assure you that your little ranch is very much subject to our community standards." The way she said little ranch made it sound like I was playing house in someone else's backyard. Over the next few weeks, Beverly's visits became as regular as clockwork and about as welcome as root canal surgery. She'd show up unannounced with new compliance notices about everything from my mailbox height to the color of my truck. 3-ton fines for unauthorized livestock when I mentioned thinking about getting some chickens, and measured me fence posts to see if they violated some obscure height regulation she'd memorized. Each time she'd end her visit with the same warning: "Mr. Thompson, I'm trying to help you avoid serious legal consequences. This community has standards, and those standards will be maintained." I started to wonder if maybe I was in over my head. Maybe city life had made me soft, and I didn't understand how things worked out here. Maybe Beverly, with all her legal jargon and clipboard confidence, knew something I didn't. That doubt lasted exactly until I opened my laptop on a lazy Tuesday morning and saw an email from Austin Premier Properties thanking me for my interest in exclusive rural listings in your area. Normally I delete that kind of spam without a second thought, but something made me click on it. The first listing that popped up made my coffee mug slip from my hands and shatter on the kitchen floor. There it was. Moonrise Ranch, complete with professional photos of my property, listed for $850,000 by Beverly Whitmore, licensed real estate professional and authorized legal representative. The description read like she'd written a love letter to my land. pristine 150-year-old heritage ranch with original horse station buildings, mature oak grove, and unlimited development potential. Solaris motivated due to estate settlement requirements. Serious inquiries only. I stared at that screen for a full 5 minutes, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. Beverly hadn't just been harassing me about HOA compliance, she'd been casing my property, taking those inspection photos, and planning to sell me ranch out from under me. The listing had been active for 3 days and already had 2 scheduled showings. According to its website, interested buyers could contact Beverly directly for private tours, and she was offering flexibly financing options for qualified purchasers. My first instinct was to call the police, then maybe a lawyer, then probably my insurance company to see if HOA president tries to steal your house was covered under my homeowner's policy. But as I sat there staring at Beverly's smug headshot next to my stolen property listing, I remembered something else Grandpa Joe used to say. Sometimes the best way to catch a fox is to let it think it's already in the henhouse. I didn't call the police. Instead, I opened my laptop wider and started the kind of investigation that Beverly Whitmore never saw coming. The first thing I did wasn't check legal documents or call a lawyer. Instead, I did what any millennial would do when faced with a crisis. I started reading online reviews, and boy did Beverly Whitmore have some interesting feedback from her satisfied customers. Turns out when you dig deep enough into the internet's memory, people love to share their horror stories about getting scammed by spoof-taunting real estate professionals who disappear faster than free pizza at a college dorm. Their views painted a picture that made my blood run cold. Sarah Martinez from Cedar Park wrote, Beverly Whitmore took her $15,000 earnest money deposit for a pre-market exclusive opportunity and then vanished when we tried to finalize the purchase. The property she showed us wasn't even hers to sell. Then there was Miguel Rodriguez, who described how Beverly had represented the sale of his elderly mother's house, collected a hefty commission, and somehow the deed transfer never quite went through properly. The most recent review, posted just 6 months ago, came from a young couple who'd lost their entire down payment savings to what they called Beverly's bait-and-switch real estate scam. I realized I needed to see Beverly in action. So, I created a fake email account under the name David Chen and reached out about viewing the ranch. Her response came back within an hour, professional and enthusiastic. Dear Mr. Chen, thank you for your interest in this exceptional heritage property. I have availability tomorrow at 2 p.m. for a private showing. This is a rare opportunity and I expect significant interest, so I encourage prompt decision-making. Best regards, Beverly Whitmore, licensed real estate professional. The confidence in her tone made my skin crawl, but it also gave me exactly what I needed, a front row seat to watch her in action. The next afternoon, I parked my truck a 4-mile down the road and walked through the woods to get a good vantage point. Near my barn, right on schedule, Beverly's white Lexus pulled into my driveway, followed by a modest Honda Civic that I assumed belonged to the actual potential buyers. I watched through binoculars as Beverly greeted a young couple with the kind of practiced warmth that real estate agents perfect over years of selling dreams to desperate people. She was wearing a different power suit, navy blue this time, and carrying the same clipboard that had become as much a part of her identity as her condescending smile. What I witnessed over the next hour was like watching a masterclass in psych. Beverly walked the couple through my property like she'd lived there her entire life, pointing out original architectural details and explaining the historical significance of buildings that she'd been trying to force me to tear down just weeks. She told them about the productive well water system and the premium agricultural soil composition with the kind of authority that comes from either deep expertise or complete shamelessness. When the husband asked about property taxes, Beverly smoothly explained that, as the estate representative, she had extensive documentation showing recent tax assessments and could guarantee a smooth transfer process. But the moment that made my jaw drop came when the wife asked about neighborhood restrictions. Beverly, the same woman who'd been threatening me with HOA violations every other day, looked the couple straight in the eye and said, "One of the best what of this property is its complete independence from any homeowners association oversight. You will have total freedom to develop and modify the land as you see fit without bureaucratic interference or community restrictions." The audacity was breathtaking. She was selling them the exact opposite of what she'd been telling me for months. That evening, I dove deeper into Beverly's background, and what I found explained a lot about her confidence and absolutely nothing about her conscience. Beverly Whitmore had indeed been a licensed real estate agent, but her license had been suspended 3 years ago following an investigation into fraudulent accusation and misrepresentation of property ownership. The state licensing board's public records showed that she'd been caught creating fake deeds and forging seller signatures on at least 4 separate occasions. Her license suspension was supposed to last 5 years, which meant she was currently operating completely outside the law. But the real bombshell came when I discovered the personal tragedy that seemed to have triggered Beverly's descent into fraud. 5 years ago, Beverly's teenage son David had been killed in a car accident. The medical bills from his 2-week fight for life in the ICU had bankrupted the family. Despite their insurance coverage, Beverly had taken out multiple loans against their house, maxed out credit cards, and even borrowed against her real estate license bonds to pay for experimental treatments that ultimately couldn't save her boy. The financial devastation had pushed her over an ethical line that she could never cross back over. I found myself feeling an unexpected pang of sympathy for Beverly, even as I prepared to take her down. Losing a child would break anyone, and the American healthcare system's ability to financially destroy families during their darkest moments was a tragedy in itself. But sympathy didn't change the fact that Beverly was now victimizing other families, probably telling herself that her circumstances justy, taking advantage of people who were just trying to find their piece of the American dream. The next morning brought another surprise that shattered any remaining illusions I had about Beverly's operation being small-time or I received a call from someone claiming to be Patricia Williams from Austin Premier Properties, asking if I was still interested in scheduling a showing for the ranch property. When I explained that I was the owner and the property wasn't for sale, there was a long pause before Patricia said, "Sir, our records show that this property is currently in a state settlement with Beverly Whitmore as the authorized representative. If you're claiming gownship, you'll need to take that up with her directly." That's when I realized Beverly hadn't just stolen my property listing. She'd created an entire fictional legal scenario where I was some kind of squatter or occupant on land that was supposedly being sold through an estate settlement. She'd even managed to convince a real estate company to list the property on their official website, which meant she'd provided them with convincing forged documentation. This wasn't opportunistic theft. It was a sophisticated long-term con game, and I was just the latest mark. But Beverly had made one critical mistake in her master plan. While she'd been busy playing real estate mogul with my property, researching her background had given me something she never expected me to find. I discovered not just her history of fraud, but also her current financial situation, and what I learned about Beverly's own house was about to turn her entire world upside down. I didn't call the police or a lawyer. I called someone Beverly had screwed over 2 years ago, and she'd been waiting for this opportunity for a time. Sophia Chen picked up on the second ring, and her voice carried the kind of sharp intelligence that comes from being burned once and never planning to let it happen again. "Marcus Thompson," she said before I could even introduce myself properly. "You're the guy with the ranch that Beverly's trying to steal. I've been wondering when you'd figure out what she was really up to." Turns out Sophia had been tracking Beverly's activities like a private investigator ever since losing 15 grand in what she called the most expensive education and real estate fraud I never wanted. Sophia was an architect who'd been looking to buy land for her dream house when she stumbled onto Beverly's website 2 years. Beverly had shown her a perfect building lot with pre-approved development permits and convinced Sophia to put down earnest money on what turned out to be land that Beverly didn't own, couldn't sell, and had no legal right to represent. By Sophia realized she'd been conned. Beverly had vanished like morning mist, leaving behind only a disconnected phony number and a fake business address. But Sophia wasn't the type to just write off $15,000 and move on with her life. She'd spent the last 2 years methodically documenting Beverly's scams, building a case file that would make Fed investigators jealous. When we met at a coffee shop in downtown Austin, Sophia spread out a folder thick enough to use as a doorstop filled with property records, court documents, and what looked like a very detailed surveillance log. "Beverly thinks she's untouchable because she moves around a lot and changes her business names," Sophie explained, pulling out a hand-drawn map that showed Beverly's territory of operations. "But she always comes back to the same hunting grounds, and she always uses the same basic playbook." Sophia's research had uncovered something that made my situation look like small potatoes compared to Beverly's larger operation. Beverly wasn't just running isolated scams. She was part of a more sophisticated network that specialized in what Sophia called estate washing. The process was diabolically simple. Find properties owned by elderly people or recent inheritance situations, create fake estate settlement documentation, and then sell the properties to unsuspecting buyers, while the real owners were either unaware or too overwhelmed to fight back effectively. The fake buyers would put down deposits, the fake sellers would pocket the money, and by the time anyone figured out what was happening, both sides were gone. Others, where Sophia's detective work revealed something that changed everything about my understanding of Beverly's current situation. Beverly wasn't just running scams to get rich. She was running them to avoid losing everything she had left. Sophia had discovered that Beverly's own house, the one she'd been living in, while harassing me about property values and community standards, was currently being foreclosed on by not one but 3 different banks. Beverly had somehow managed to take out multiple mortgages on the same property using different variations of her name and fake employment documentation. She owed over $400,000 on a house that was worth maybe $250,000 in the current market. "She's in a house of cards that's about to collapse," Sophia explained, showing me the foreclosure notices that had been filed in public records. "The first bank is scheduled to auction the property next month. The second bank is preparing its legal action, and the third one hasn't even realized it's been defrauded yet. Beverly is running these property scams because she's desperate to generate enough cash to pay off at least one of the banks and avoid losing her house entirely. The irony was breathtaking. Beverly, who'd been lecturing me about property values and community standards, was living in a financial disaster zone that made my inherited ranch look like a fortress of stability. Sophia had even more intelligence than Beverly painted as someone operating in full panic mode. Beverly had been showing Sophia's old property, the one she'd failed to steal 2 years ago, to new potential buyers just last month. She was recycling her old scams, going back to properties she'd already burned, which Sophia interpreted as a sign of desperation. When scam artists start repeating their old cons, it usually means they're owning out of new opportunities and getting sloppy, Sophia explained. Beverly's making mistakes now that she never would have made when she was thinking clearly. That's when Sophia told me about her plan, and it was absolutely beautiful in its poetic justice. While Beverly had been busy playing real estate agent with my property, Sophia had been preparing for the upcoming foreclosure auction of Beverly's house. She'd done hair search, lined up financing, and was planning to bid on the property when it went to auction next month. "I want to buy Beverly's house and turn it into the thing she hates most," Sophia said with a smile that was equal parts sweet revenge and social justice, a resource center for people who've been victims of real estate. For all, I want her to drive past their old house every day and see people getting the help she never provided. But Sophia's plan required perfect timing and a coordinated effort that she couldn't pull off alone. That's where I came in. While Beverly was focused on trying to steal my ranch, Sophia needed someone to help her gather the final pieces of evidence that would ensure Beverly's legal troubles caught up with her before she could escape to victimize more families. Sophia had been building her case methodically, but she needed proof of Beverly's current activities to demonstrate that this was an ongoing criminal enterprise rather than just old allegations. The next phase of our plan required something that made me nervous, but also excited in a way I hadn't felt since solving particularly complex coding problems. We were going to let Beverly continue her charade with my property, but we were going to document everything she did and use it to build an airtight case against her. Sophia would handle the legal research and evidence collection while I would play the role of unwitting victim just long enough to give Beverly enough rope to hang herself with. But as Sophia packed up her surveillance files and prepared to leave, she warned me about something that I should have seen coming. "Marcus, you need to understand that when Beverly realizes she's losing control of this situation, she's going to escalate. Desperate people do desperate things. And Beverly's got nothing left to lose. She's going to come at you harder than anything you've experienced so far. And she's going to use every trick in her playbook to try to scare you into backing down." Looking back now, I realized that Sophia's warning was probably the most important advice Yon had ever given me, even though I had no idea just how prophetic her words would turn out to be. Beverly thought was being clever by inviting local news reporters to her community presentation, but she had no idea that those same cameras would capture the moment of her complete downfall. I'm Jason Miller, living in Chicago, and I'm the storyteller on this channel. How do you find my reading voice? Please let me know in the comments below. Sophia and I had spent the previous week executing our plan with the precision of a military operation while Beverly was busy preparing her public relations offensive. We were filing our complaint with complete evidence to the police and simultaneously preparing for something Beverly never saw coming. Sophia had been working behind the scenes with her bank contacts to ensure that when Beverly's house went to auction, we'd be ready to bid. But the timing had to be perfect because we needed Beverly to be completely distracted when the legal hammer finally came down on her. The community presentation was Beverly's masterstroke, or at least she thought it was. She'd somehow convinced the Sunset Hills Community Center to host what she called a public safety forum about unauthorized land use and property value protection. She'd even managed to get a reporter from the local Austin newspaper to attend, along with someone from the neighborhood blog that covered HOA disputes. Beverly had transformed herself for the occasion, wearing a burgundy business suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent and carrying a leather portfolio that she kept referring to as her documentation of community violations. The presentation itself was a masterclass in manipulation and outright fabrication. Beverly stood in front of about 30 residents, using a PowerPoint presentation that she'd spent considerable time preparing, complete with photos of my ranch that she'd taken during her inspections. She painted a picture of me as some kind of dangerous outsider who was threatening the very of their community. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said with a kind of grave authority usually reserved for announcing natural disasters, "we have a situation that threatens not just our property values but our safety and security as a community." Beverly's presentation included evidence that I was operating an illegal agricultural asset on improperly zoned residential land. She claimed that my presence was attracting undesirable elements to the neighborhood and that my refusal to comply with community standards was already causing measurable decreases in surrounding property values. She even produced what she claimed were official property assessments, showing that houses within a half-mile radius of my ranch had dropped in value since I'd moved in. The documentation looked official enough to fool most people, complete with county seals and legal terminology that sounded convincing if you didn't know what to look for. But the moment that really showcased Beverly's complete detachment from reality came when she started talking about emergency community action. She told the assembled residents that sometimes legal channels move to slow to protect community interests and that concerned citizens might need to take appropriate steps to encourage compliance with community standards. The way she said it made it sound like she was suggesting some kind of citizenserist or community intervention, but the subtext was clear. She was trying to recruit a mob to help her intimidate me into leaving. That's when something beautiful and completely unexpected, penned Mrs. Henderson, a 78-year-old woman who'd been sitting quietly in the back row, slowly stood up and asked for permission to speak. Beverly, thinking she was about to receive support from our community elder, graciously welcomed Mrs. Henderson to share her thoughts. What came next was the kind of public revelation that makes you believe in karma and cosmic justice. I've been living in this community for 43 years, Mrs. Henderson said in a voice that carried the authority of someone who'd seen everything and wasn't impressed. And I was the head librarian when we built the community library with donated funds back in 1973. Young lady, she continued, looking directly at Beverly. The house you're living in right now was built with money donated by the Thompson family, specifically by Joseph Thompson, who was this young man's grandfather. The room went completely silent as Mrs. Henderson continued her impromptu history lesson. Joe Thompson donated 50% of the money needed to build that library, and his name is carved right into the foundation stone if anyone bothers to look. That building served our community for 22 years before the city built the new library downtown. When the old library was sold, it was sold with the understanding that it would continue to serve the community in some way. Instead, you've been using a building that was paid for by community donations to launch attacks against the very family that helped build it. The transformation in the room was immediate and dramatic. You could watch their crowd's perceptions shift as Mrs. Henderson's words sank in. People started murmuring to each other, and several residents began looking at Beverly like they were seeing her clearly for the first time. Beverly tried to regain control of the narrative, insisting that historical donations don't create ongoing legal obligations. But the damage was done. Her authority had been completely undermined by someone with the actual community credibility. But Mrs. Henderson wasn't finished. She pulled out a manila folder that looked like it had been waiting decades for this exact moment. I also have here the original deed transfer documents from when the library was sold, which clearly the property was sold to Beverly and Robert Whitmore as joint owners. But according to the county clerk's office, Robert Whitmore died 3 years ago, which means Beverly has been making financial decisions about jointly owned property without proper legal authority. The folder contained photocopies of documents that Mrs. Henderson had been saving for exactly this kind of occasion. That's when Beverly made the mistake that sealed her fate. Instead of offering to explain or deflect, she lost her temper completely. "You old busybody," she snapped at Mrs. Henderson. "You don't know what you're talking about, and you need to mind your own business, Bear. You get yourself in trouble." The room erupted in shocked murmurs because Beverly had just insulted the most respected member of their community in front of witnesses and cameras. But her outburst also revealed something that Sophia and I had been hoping to provoke. Beverly was cracking under pressure and starting to make the kind of mistakes that would destroy her credibility completely, right on cue, as if we'd scripted the whole thing. Police cars started pulling into the community center parking lot. But what happened next was something that even Sophia and Andy hadn't anticipated. And it would change everything about how this story ended. The person stepping out of Thepali's car wasn't a police officer. It was a man I'd never met before. But Beverly looked at him like she'd just seen a ghost rise from the grave. The color drained from her face so completely that I thought she might, right there in front of 30 community members and 2 news cameras. The man was tall, probably in his early 50s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that comes from spending too much time worrying about things you can't control. He walked toward the community center with the deliberate pace of someone who'd been planning Thisman for a very long time. "Hello, Beverly," the man said as he entered the room, and his voice carried the weight of unfinished business and long-buried secrets. "I think we need to talk." Beverly's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no sound came out. The room, which had been buzzing with post-presentation chatter just moments before, fell into the kind of silence that makes a Virian instantly hold their breath. Even the reporters seemed to sense that whatever was happening was bigger than HOA dispute they'd come to cover. The man introduced himself to the room as Robert Whitmore, Beverly's husband, who, according to Beverly's financial documents and Mrs. Henderson's research, had supposedly died 3 years ago. But he was very much alive and very unhappy about being declared dead by his wife. "I've been living in Vancouver for the past 3 years. Robert explained to the stunned audience, "working with the FBI to investigate a real estate fraud network that my wife became involved with after our son's death. The revelations that followed were like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion, with each new piece of information making Beverly's situation exponentially worse." Robert explained that he discovered Beverly's fraudulent activities Shortly after their son David's funeral, when he found out that she'd been using his grief and absence from home to forge his signature on various financial documents, Beverly started small, Robert said, his voice heavy with a mixture of sadness and disappointment, a few thousand here and there to cover medical bills that insurance wouldn't pay. But after I confronted her and she promised to stop, I discovered she'd escalated to much larger operations. What made Robert's testimony particularly devastating was that he'd been documenting Beverly's crimes from the inside for years. He'd been working with federal investigators to build a case against not just Beverly, but an entire network of people who specialized in real estate fraud, targeting vulnerable families. The FBI asked me to maintain my cover as a dead husband while they gathered evidence about the larger operation, Robert explained. Beverly thought she'd successfully faked my death to claim life insurance money and gain sole control of our assets. What she didn't know was that I'd been feeding information to federal investigators the entire time. Beverly, who had been sullen since Robert's appearance, finally found her voice. But what came out was a desperate stream of justifications and accusations that only made her situation worse. "You don't understand," she said, her voice cracking with emotion and panic. "I was trying to save our son. The doctors said there were experimental treatments, clinical trials, that insurance wouldn't cover. I needed money to give David every possible chance." Her eyes were filling with tears, but they were the tears of someone who'd convinced themselves that good intentions justified terrible actions. "Beverly," Robert replied with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation many times before. "David died 5 years ago. You've been using his memory to justify stealing from families for 3 years after we buried him. These people," he guessed, the community members who were watching this family drama unfold, "they didn't kill our son. They don't owe you say anything, and destroying their lives won't bring David back." But the most shocking revelation was still coming. Robert pulled out a thick folder that looked remarkably similar to Sophia's surveillance files and began reading from what appeared to be official federal documents. "Beverly has been operating under at least 6 different business names over the past 3 years. She's defrauded 47 families across 4 states with total losses exceeding $2 million. The property she's been living in has been used as collateral for fraudulent loans with 11 different financial institutions." Mrs. Henderson, who had been quietly observing this wall exchange, raised her hand like she was still in a classroom. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "if you've been alive this whole time, then Beverly never had legal authority to sell or mortgage the library building, did she?" Robert shook his head grimly. "No, ma'am. Every financial transaction Beverly made using that property was completely fraudulent. She's been living in a house that she legally had no right to mortgage or modify without my consent." The federal charges that Robert outlined were staggering. Beverly was facing prosecution for wire fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, forgery, money laundering, and what Robert called aggravated real estate fraud. But what made her situation even more desperate was that the FBI had been tracking her current activities in real time. "They know about the fake listing for Mr. Thompson's ranch," Robert said, looking directly at me. "They have recorded phone conversations, email evidence, and financial records showing exactly how Beverly was planning to steal and sell your property." Sophia, who had been taking notes throughout this entire revelation, asked the question that wasn't everyone's mind. "If the FBI has all this evidence, why didn't they arrest Beverly sooner?" Robert's answer explained everything about the timing of today's confrontation. They wanted to catch the people Beverly was working with, the ones who helped process the fake documentation and launder the money. Today's operation was designed to tow Beverly's biggest score yet, which would have drawn out her accomplices and given the FBI everything they need, dead to roll up the entire network. But the story was far from over. As Robert finished explaining the federal investigation, Beverly stood up with the kind of manic energy that comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose. "You think you're so smart," she said, looking around the room at all the faces staring back at her with a mixture of horror and fascination. "But you have no idea what's been happening here. None of you understand what I've had to sacrifice, what I've had to do to survive in this world that doesn't care about people like me." What Beverly said next would change everything about how this story ended, and it would reveal a final twist that none of us, not even Robert or the FBI, had seen coming. By this point, Marcus had realized why Beverly had been so recklessly bold throughout this entire ordeal. She'd been preparing a plan B from the very beginning, and what she was about to reveal would shake everyone in that room to their core. Beverly's desperate energy transformed into something far more dangerous, the calculated fury of someone who'd been cornered but still had one last card to play. She reached into her leather portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She slammed down on the presentation table with enough force to make everyone in the room jump. "You want to talk about legal authority and property rights," Beverly said, her voice rising to a pitch that made several community members unconsciously lean back in their chairs. "Let me show you some real legal authority." She began spreading documents across the table like a blackjack dealer, revealing a winning hand. Every single property transaction in this community for the past 18 months has gone through my review and approval process. Every refinancing, every sale, every estate settlement has required Miss Signature as the designated community legal representative. The documents Beverly was displaying looked official enough to fool most people, complete with county seals, notary stamps, and the kind of dense legal language that makes normal people's eyes glaze over. But Sophia, who'd been studying Beverly's methods for 2 years, immediately recognized what she was looking at. These weren't just forged individual documents. Beverly had created an entire fictional legal framework that positioned her as some kind of community property overseer with broad authority over real estate transactions in the area. Mrs. Whitmore, Mrs. Henderson said in the tone of some man who'd spent decades dealing with people trying to pull fast ones in the library. There is no such thing as a community legal representative position in Texas property law. You can't just create fake government positions and expect people to believe they're real. But Beverly wasn't listening to reason anymore. She was operating in full desperation mode, doubling down on lies that were becoming more elaborate and less believable by the minute. That's when Beverly dropped her biggest bombshell yet. The revelation that explained why she'd been so stealing my ranch and why she thought she could get away with anything. The reason I have authority over these properties, she announced with the kind of theatrical flourish usually reserved for courtroom dramas, is because I own the underlying mineral and water rights for this entire subdivision. When my family purchased the original land grant in 1847, those rights were included in perpetuity, which means every property owner in this area is essentially a tenant on my family's historical claim. The room erupted in confused murmurs as people tried to process what Beverly was. She was essentially arguing that she owned invisible underground rights that superseded everyone else's surface property ownership, which would give her legal authority to make decisions about how their land could be used. It was the kind of legal argument that sounded just plausible enough to scare people who didn't understand property law, but ridiculous enough to make anyone with actual legal knowledge want to laugh out loud. But here's where Sophia and I revealed the surprise that Beverly never saw coming. The move we'd been planning while she was busy playing legal theater for the crowd. Sophia stood up and pulled out her stack of documents. But these weren't forged papers or fictional legal claims. These were real estate auction confirmation papers, bank transfer receipts, and a deed transfer document that had been officially recorded with the county clerk just 3 hours earlier. Beverly, Sophia said with the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from winning a game where your opponent doesn't even know they've lost. While you were busy preparing this presentation and creating fake legal documents, Marcus and I successfully purchased your house at the foreclosure auction that took place this morning. You are currently standing in a community center, claiming to own mineral rights you don't have, while living in a house that now legally belongs to us. The transformation in Beverly's face was like watching someone's entire world collapse in real time. Her confident smirk melted into confusion, then shock, then a kind of desperate fury that made several people in the room start looking toward the exits. "That's impossible," she said, her voice cracking. "The auction wasn't settled until next month. I would have received notice. I would have had time to work out a payment plan." Robert, who had been quietly observing his wife's meltdown, finally stepped forward with an expression that mixed pity with grim. "Beverly, the foreclosure notices were sent to our legal address, which you changed without my permission when you thought I was dead. The bank has been trying to contact you for 6 months, but all their to a P.O. box that you abandoned when you moved your operation to this area. But the legal revelations weren't finished yet." Sophia pulled out one final document that represented the culmination of 2 years of planning and preparation. "Beverly, we didn't just buy your house to get revenge. We bought it because we researched its history and discovered something that makes this situation even more poetic than we originally planned." Sophia held up a historical deed that she'd found in the county archives, a document that told a story Beverly had probably never bothered to investigate. "Your house, the one you've been living in while trying to steal Marcus's ranch, was built in 1973 using money donated by the Thompson family to create a community library. Marcus's grandfather, Joseph Thompson, donated 50% of the construction costs, and the building was intended to serve the community forever. When the library was eventually sold to private buyers, it was sold with DID restrictions that required it to continue serving community purposes. Their ending was so perfect it felt like cosmic justice. Beverly had been living in a house that was built with money from the same family she was trying to victimize. And now that house was going to be used exactly as it was originally intended to, serve and protect the community. Sophia announced that we planned to convert Beverly's former home into the David Whitmore Community Legal Aid Center, named after her deceased son, where people could get free legal advice to protect themselves from real estate fraud. Beverly's response to this final revelation was something none of us expected. Instead of anger or despair, she began laughing, a high-pitched sound that made everyone in the room deeply uncomfortable. "You think you've won," she said, looking around at all the faces staring back at her with a mixture of horror and fascination. "But you have no idea what you've just stepped into. This isn't over. This will never be over. What Beverly said next would reveal the final twist that none of us, not even the FBI, had anticipated. What Beverly revealed in that moment of desperate laughter changed everything we thought we knew about her operation, and showed us that sometimes the best victories come not from destroying your enemies, but from giving them a chance to redeem themselves. Beverly's manic energy suddenly shifted into something that looked almost like relief, as if she'd been carrying a terrible secret for so long that letting it out felt like removing a crushing weight from her shoulders. "You want to know the real truth about why I've been doing all of this," she said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper that somehow commanded more attention than all her previous shouting. "David didn't just die in a car accident," Beverly continued. And for the first time since this whole ordeal began, her voice carried genuine emotion instead of calculated manipulation. "He was driving home from his job at a legal aid clinic where he'd been volunteering to help families avoid foreclosure and real estate scams. My son spent his last months on Earth protecting people from exactly the kind of person I became. He died." The room fell into the kind of silence that comes when everyone realizes they're witnessing something more profound than a simple fraud case. Beverly explained that David had discovered a network of predatory real estate practices, targeting elderly and vulnerable families in rural Texas communities. He'd been building a case file and working with victims to prepare a class action lawsuit when he was killed. After David died, I found his research, his evidence, all the work he'd been doing to protect people, and instead of continuing his mission, he became everything he was fighting against. I told myself I needed money to honor his memory, but I was just running away from the guilt of knowing that I'd failed him completely. But here's where the story took a turn that none of you expected, including the FBI agents who had been quietly monitoring the situation from outside the community center. Beverly reached into her jacket and pulled out a flash drive that she placed on the table like she was surrendering a weapon. "Everything David collected about the real estate fraud network is on this drive: names, bank accounts, property records, and recorded phone conversations with the people who've been running these operations across for states. I've been working for them, but I've also been documenting everything they do." Robert stepped with an expression that mixed hope with deep skepticism. "Beverly, are you saying you've been gathering evidence against the people who recruited you?" Beverly nodded, tears streaming down her face in a way that looked genuine for the first time since I'd met her. "David always said that the best way to fight corruption is to document everything and wait for the right moment to bring it all to light. I know I can't bring him back, and I know I can't undo the damage I've done to all these families, but maybe I can finish what he started." The FBI agents haunted the community center at that moment weren't there to arrest Beverly, although she certainly deserved it. They were there to collect her evidence and offer her something that shocked everyone in the room: a plea agreement that would allow her to serve her sentence by working with federal investigators to dismantle the Lager network that had been operating across the region. "Mrs. Whitmore," the lead agent explained, "your information has helped us identify 43 additional perpetrators and recover over $6 million in stolen assets. If you're willing to continue cooperating, we can work with the courts to structure your sentence around community service rather than prison time." Sophia and I looked at each other with the kind of understanding that comes from realizing that sometimes justice looks different than what you originally imagined. We'd gotten our revenge by buying Beverly's house, but now we had an opportunity to do something that would honor both David's memory and the community that had been damaged by his mother's actions. "Beverly," Sophia said, "we meant what we said about turning your house into a legal aid center, but instead of just naming it after David, what if you helped us run it? What if you used your experience as someone who's been on both sides of these scams to teach people how to protect themselves?" The transformation in Beverly's demeanor was remarkable. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked like someone who had found a purpose beyond her pain and desperation. "You would trust me to do that?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "After everything I've done, you'd give me a chance to help people instead of hurt them?" Mrs. Henderson, who had been quietly observing this entire exchange, stood up with the authority of someone who'd seen enough of life to know genuine remorse when she encountered it. "Beverly," Mrs. Henderson said, "your son would want you to spend your remaining years protecting families, not destroying them, but you'll be working under supervision. And every penny that goes through that legal aid center will be monitored by people who know exactly how creative you can be with financial records." It was forgiveness with accountability, redemption with realistic safeguards. 6 months later, the David Whitmore Community Legal Aid Center opened its doors in Beverly's former home, and the woman who had once been the terror of the neighborhood became its most effective educator about real estate fraud prevention. Beverly's classes, titled "Confessions of a Reformed Scammer," who became so popular that people drove from 3 counties away to hear her explain the warning signs and legal protections that could have saved them from people like she used to be. She spoke with the authority of someone who knew every trick in the book because she'd used them all herself. The final twist came exactly 1 year after that community center confrontation, when I received a letter that had been delivered to my ranch address but was intended for Beverly. The return address was from the Texas State Bar Association, and Inside was a notification that Beverly Whitmore had been selected to receive the David Whitmore Memorial Award for Community Legal Education, an honor named after her son and given to people who dedicated their lives to protecting vulnerable families from legal. Beverly had wanted to steal my ranch to get money for herself. In the end, her own house helped me protect an entire community from people just like she used to be. Grandpa Joe was right when he said, sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is to turn them into a teacher. And today, when I see Beverly standing in front of young families, teaching them how to protect their most precious assets, I understand that this was truly the only victory worth having. The woman who once threatened to destroy my family's legacy ended up helping me honor it in ways I never could have imagined alone. Sometimes we all feel powerless against people who abuse their authority or try to take advantage of us. But Marcus' story proves that with patience, intelligence, and the right allies, even the most impossible situations can be turned around. We all deserve to feel safe in our own homes and protected from those who would exploit our trust. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to Alex Stories.